If you drove Interstate 80 back in the 70s, chances are you heard about Uncle Bob before you ever met him. Not because he owned the biggest truck, not because he drove the fastest, and certainly not because he wanted anyone talking about it. People remembered Uncle Bob for a different reason. If your truck broke down in the middle of nowhere, if a snowstorm trapped you on a mountain pass, or if you simply needed someone to answer the CB radio during a lonely night, somehow, Uncle Bob always seemed to appear. No one could explain it. Drivers joked that he knew every mile of highway by heart. Some even claimed he could hear a stranded truck long before the radio ever came alive. Whether any of that was true didn't really matter, because every truck driver had at least one Uncle Bob story. Mine began during my very first winter on the road. I had been driving for only a few months, and everything still felt new. Every state looked unfamiliar. Every mountain seemed taller than the last. Back then, I believed trucking was mostly about driving, keeping the wheels turning, making deliveries on time, collecting another paycheck. It took years before I realized trucking had never really been about trucks. It had always been about people. I didn't understand that until I met Uncle Bob. It was late November, the kind of evening when daylight disappears much earlier than you expect. Clouds rolled across the sky, hiding the last traces of the sun. The temperature dropped with every passing mile. My dispatcher had given me a simple load. Nothing oversized, nothing unusual, just another refrigerated trailer heading west. The weather forecast mentioned light snow. Nothing serious. At least, that's what everyone thought. The first snowflakes appeared just after sunset, tiny white specks drifting through the glow of my headlights. For a while, they almost looked peaceful. The highway slowly emptied. Cars became fewer. The voices on the CB radio grew quieter. Before long, it felt as though I had the entire interstate to myself. I wasn't afraid. Not yet. In those days, I still believed every problem had a simple solution. If something broke, you fixed it. If traffic slowed, you waited. If it snowed, you drove carefully. Experience has a funny way of changing simple ideas. About an hour later, the snowfall became heavier. The white lines on the pavement began disappearing beneath fresh snow. The trees along the roadside faded into darkness. Even the reflective signs looked softer. The windshield wipers settled into a steady rhythm. Back and forth, almost hypnotic. The heater filled the cab with warm air. Coffee rested quietly in the cup holder beside me. The engine hummed with calm confidence. For a while, everything felt perfectly under control. Then the wind arrived. It came without warning. A long, powerful gust swept across the highway, pushing against the trailer. The steering wheel grew heavier in my hands. Another gust followed, then another. Loose snow lifted from the fields beside the road, swirling across the pavement like white waves. Visibility began shrinking mile by mile. I leaned forward slightly, not because it helped me see any better, but because every truck driver does it without thinking. Soon I could barely make out the taillights of the truck several hundred feet ahead. Then, they disappeared completely. The radio remained silent. No voices, no conversations, only the soft hiss of an open channel. I remember glancing at the outside temperature. It had fallen well below freezing. The truck kept moving steadily, but something inside me had changed. For the first time since earning my CDL, I realized how small one truck can feel against a winter storm. The highway signs announced another mountain pass only 20 miles ahead. I had never crossed it before. I considered stopping. Then I noticed something. Far ahead, barely visible through the snow, a line of glowing amber lights moved slowly across the darkness. Not emergency vehicles, not construction equipment, just an old tractor pulling a dry van. Its roof marker lights glowed with a warm orange color that somehow stood out against the storm. Without thinking, I eased off the throttle, not to fall behind, but to stay behind. There was something strangely comforting about following another truck through bad weather, especially one driven by someone who looked completely unhurried. The distance between us remained almost exactly the same. Half a mile, sometimes less, sometimes more. The truck ahead never accelerated, never drifted, never seemed bothered by the wind. Its steady pace made the storm feel a little smaller, almost without realizing it. I found myself matching every movement, every gentle correction, every careful speed adjustment. For the next 30 minutes, the glowing amber lights became my entire world. Then the CB radio crackled. A calm, older voice filled the cab. Blue Freightliner behind me. A short pause. "You're doing just fine." I looked around instinctively. There wasn't another truck anywhere in sight. The voice continued. "Don't chase the storm. Just drive your truck." There was something about the way he said those words. Slowly, patiently, like someone who had repeated them 100 times before. I reached for the microphone. "This is my first winter," I admitted. For a second, only static answered. Then came a quiet chuckle. I figured. "My name's Bob." Another short pause. "But everybody out here," he said with a smile I could somehow hear through the radio, "just calls me Uncle Bob." For the next several miles, I stayed behind Uncle Bob's truck. Not because I had to, because it simply felt like the right place to be. His old Freightliner moved through the storm with quiet confidence. It wasn't fast. It wasn't flashy. It just seemed to understand winter better than the rest of us. The amber marker lights glowed softly against the falling snow. Every few seconds they disappeared behind a curtain of white, only to emerge again like a lighthouse through fog. The CB remained quiet for a while. Neither of us felt the need to speak. Sometimes silence is the best conversation two truck drivers can have. Eventually his voice returned. "Where'd you learn to drive?" "A trucking school in Nebraska. Fresh out. About 4 months." He laughed gently. "I thought so. You've been watching my mirrors instead of watching your own road." I smiled without realizing it. He was right. I guess I have. Nothing wrong with following another truck. He said, "Just don't forget to drive your own." Those words stayed with me, not just that night, for years afterward. The snow eased a little as we climbed higher into the mountains. The road curved gently between tall pine trees whose branches sagged beneath fresh snow. Everything beyond the headlights faded into darkness. The pass wasn't especially steep, but it demanded patience. Every curve asked for smooth steering. Every downhill stretch reminded you not to rush. Up ahead, Uncle Bob's brake lights never flashed suddenly. Instead, he slowed using the engine whenever he could. Everything he did looked effortless. I copied him without thinking. Looking back now, I realized that night became my first real lesson in trucking. Not because someone stood in front of a classroom, because someone showed me instead. Near the summit, the snowfall almost stopped. Clouds broke apart just enough for a few stars to appear overhead. The road grew quieter. The wind finally settled. Uncle Bob spoke again. "You know why most rookies get into trouble?" I figured it was speed. Sometimes. He paused. But most of the time, it's because they're trying to prove something. I thought about that for a moment. Prove what? That they're better than the weather. He chuckled softly. The weather always wins. I couldn't argue with that. As we started down the western side of the pass, the road became easier. Snow turned into light flurries. The pavement looked darker where salt trucks had already been through. The worst of the storm was behind us. About 20 miles later, Uncle Bob's right turn signal blinked. He eased onto the exit ramp, leading to a small truck stop. I followed. The parking lot held only a handful of trucks. Most were already shut down for the night. Their marker lights reflected softly across the wet pavement. Inside the diner, warm yellow lights welcomed anyone willing to leave the cold behind. The smell of fresh coffee filled the room. Someone had a country song playing quietly on the jukebox. Uncle Bob was easy to recognize, not because he looked extraordinary, because he looked exactly like the kind of truck driver you'd hope to meet. He was tall, broad-shouldered, probably in his late 60s. His gray beard was neatly trimmed, and his denim jacket looked older than some of the trucks outside. A faded baseball cap rested low over kind blue eyes that had clearly spent decades watching highways disappear beneath a windshield. When he smiled, the lines around his eyes deepened, not from age alone, from years of smiling at strangers. He waved me over before I even ordered my coffee. "You must be the Freightliner behind me." "I guess I am." He pulled out the chair across from him. "Sit down. I'll buy the first cup." That surprised me. "You don't have to do that." He shrugged. "Someone bought mine 40 years ago. I've just been returning the favor ever since." The waitress brought 2 steaming mugs without asking what either of us wanted. "You boys survived the pass?" she asked. "We did," Uncle Bob answered. "I told you he'd make it." She smiled at me. "He says that about every rookie." Bob laughed. "Because most of them do." For the next hour, we talked about everything except trucking, fishing, old diners, country music, his grandchildren, the little towns he'd watched grow over the decades. Only once did I ask the question that had been sitting in my mind all evening. "How long have you been driving?" He leaned back in his chair, looked toward the frosted diner window. "A long enough time," he said quietly, "that I can still remember my first truck." There was something different in his voice now. Not sadness, not nostalgia, just warmth. It wasn't much. An old Mac with more rust than paint. The heater barely worked. The driver's seat leaned to one side. And if you hit a pothole, the passenger door would sometimes pop open. I laughed. "So why'd you keep it?" He wrapped both hands around his coffee mug. "Because," he said with a smile, "it gave a kid from a little farming town his first chance to see America." Outside, snow continued falling gently beneath the truck stop lights. Inside, I had the feeling that I was about to hear the beginning of a story that had started long before I was born. For a little while, neither of us spoke. The snow drifted quietly past the diner windows. Somewhere outside, another truck pulled into the parking lot, its diesel engine settling into a slow, familiar idle. Uncle Bob took another sip of coffee. He smiled at the mug for a moment, as though remembering something from long ago. "My first truck," he said softly, "taught me more about life than any person ever could." It was a 1968 Mac, dark green. The paint was already faded when I bought it. The chrome wasn't really chrome anymore, and if you drove faster than 65, he laughed quietly. The whole dashboard started rattling like it wanted to leave before I did. I couldn't help smiling. "But every morning," he continued, "that old Mac started. Didn't matter if it was summer in Arizona. or winter in Wyoming. It always gave me another day. He looked out the window again. The reflection of the truck stop lights shimmered softly across the glass. I didn't have much money back then. My apartment was small. My savings account was even smaller. But every Friday evening, I'd point that Mac toward another state. And somehow, the whole world felt wide open. Back then, interstates weren't nearly as crowded. Truck stops were smaller. CB radios had only just begun appearing in more cabs. Paper maps covered half the passenger seat. If you missed your exit, there was no voice telling you to make a U-turn. You figured it out yourself. And honestly, Bob said, I think we worried a little less. There wasn't much choice. If something broke, you fixed it. If you got lost, you asked another driver. If you needed help, somebody usually stopped. He wasn't saying the old days were better, only different. The road changes. So do trucks. But good people, they've always been out here. The waitress walked by carrying a fresh pot of coffee. Without asking, she topped off both of our mugs. You two solving the world's problems? She joked. Bob smiled. No, just remembering it. She laughed before walking toward another table. I noticed that nearly everyone inside seemed to know him. Drivers nodded as they passed. One older man walked over just long enough to shake his hand. Bob, good to see you again. You too, Charlie. No introductions. No explanations. Just quiet respect. After Charlie left, I finally asked the question that had been sitting in my mind. Why does everyone call you Uncle Bob? He leaned back in the booth. A smile slowly crossed his face. I honestly don't know. I never asked for it. It just sort of happened. He chuckled. I think it started sometime in the early 80s. There was a young driver who kept calling me that over the radio. I helped him chain up in Colorado. A few weeks later, someone else called me Uncle Bob, then another. Eventually, even drivers older than me were calling me Uncle Bob. I laughed. So your real name isn't Bob? Oh, it is. Robert William Dawson. But I haven't heard anyone call me Robert in years. He looked almost amused by the thought. I don't think I'd answer if they did. The two of us laughed quietly together. Outside, the snowfall had almost stopped. Clouds drifted apart, revealing a sky filled with stars. Truck stop parking lots always look peaceful after midnight. Rows of parked tractors, tiny amber marker lights glowing softly. Curtains pulled closed inside sleeper cabs. Hundreds of drivers, each carrying a different story. Bob noticed me looking outside. Beautiful, isn't it? It is. You know, he said. Most folks think truck drivers spend their lives chasing destinations. He shook his head. They've got it backwards. I looked at him curiously. We're not chasing destinations. We're collecting mornings. I must have looked confused. He smiled. Think about it. Sunrise over Montana. Morning fog in Tennessee. Fresh coffee in Iowa. The smell of rain in Texas. The first snow in the Dakotas. He paused. Most people see those places once on vacation. We get to watch them change every season. I had never thought about it that way. To me, every delivery had been another job. To Uncle Bob, every mile had become another memory. That was the difference between someone who drove trucks and someone who truly lived on the road. He finished the last sip of his coffee, set the mug gently onto the table. You know, he said quietly, I've probably forgotten more highways than I can remember, but there are certain nights that stay with you forever. He looked toward the snow-covered Freightliner parked outside beneath the glowing truck stop lights. And one of those nights, he said with a gentle smile, began with a little boy standing beside an old gas pump in New Mexico. I leaned forward without realizing it. Some stories invite you to listen. Others make the whole room disappear. I had a feeling this one was going to do both. The snow had stopped completely by the time we stepped back outside. A thin layer of fresh white covered the parking lot, softening every sound around us. Even the trucks seemed quieter beneath the clear night sky. Uncle Bob walked slowly toward his old Freightliner. He rested one hand on the driver's door for a moment before climbing inside. There was something familiar about the gesture, almost like greeting an old friend. I followed in my own truck as we pulled back onto the interstate. The roads were nearly empty now. Only a few taillights drifted across the horizon. For the next hour, we drove without saying much over the CB. We didn't need to. The steady rhythm of two diesel engines was conversation enough. Watching Uncle Bob drive was like watching someone who had stopped thinking about driving years ago. Every movement came naturally. Every lane change was smooth. Every curve seemed to arrive exactly when he expected it. He never hurried. Not because his truck couldn't go faster, because he had learned long ago that the road always rewarded patience. Years later, I realized that was one of the greatest lessons he ever taught me. Not through advice, simply by the way he lived. Whenever people asked him how many miles he had driven, he never gave an exact number. I honestly don't think he knew. After 40 years behind the wheel, the miles had blended together. Only the memories remained. He remembered little diners hidden beside forgotten highways. He remembered old wooden bridges that had long since been replaced. He remembered towns that no longer appeared on most maps. But more than anything, he remembered people. Some had shared nothing more than a cup of coffee. Others had become lifelong friends after one chance meeting during a snowstorm. For Uncle Bob, every face belonged to a place, and every place carried a story. He once told me that highways connect far more than cities. They connect lives. At the time, I didn't fully understand what he meant. I would eventually learn. As the miles passed beneath our wheels, the eastern horizon slowly began to brighten. Not with sunrise, with moonlight breaking through the last remaining clouds. The silver light spilled across frozen fields, giving the landscape a peaceful glow. Telephone poles cast long shadows over the snow. Farmhouses stood quietly in the distance. Everything looked still. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, we passed an old service station that had long since closed. Its weathered sign still stood beside the highway. The fuel pumps had disappeared years ago. Only the building remained. I noticed Uncle Bob ease off the throttle ever so slightly as we passed. Just for a moment. Then he continued. Later, during breakfast, I asked why. He smiled quietly before answering. That old station had been the first place where he ever fueled his own truck. Back then, he had barely enough money to fill half the tanks. He remembered counting every dollar before walking inside. The owner had noticed. Without saying much, he poured another 20 gallons into the truck and simply waved him back onto the road. No contract, no paperwork, no questions. Just one truck driver helping another young man chase a dream. Uncle Bob said he returned years later to pay the man back. The owner refused to take the money. Instead, he asked for one promise. Whenever you meet someone who needs a little help, do the same for them. That simple promise stayed with Uncle Bob for the rest of his life. He never spoke about it often. He didn't have to. You could see it in the way he treated people. He always carried extra work gloves in the side compartment. Not because he needed them, because someone else eventually would. There was always another flashlight, another blanket, another thermos of coffee. If a driver looked tired, Uncle Bob would invite him to sit for a while. If someone looked worried, he'd remind them that every storm eventually runs out of snow. None of those moments were dramatic. Most lasted only a few minutes. Yet somehow, they stayed with people for decades. I think that's why everyone remembered him. Not because he drove farther than anyone else. Not because he owned the nicest truck, but because he made the road feel a little less lonely. Long after that first winter, I began noticing something. No matter where we traveled, someone always seemed to recognize Uncle Bob. A wave from another truck, a smile from a waitress, a mechanic calling his name from across a shop. He belonged to the highway in a way very few people ever do. Not because he had spent his life there, but because he had spent that life making it better for everyone around him. And as dawn slowly approached beyond the rolling hills, I realized I still knew only a small part of his story. The years before I met him held countless more memories. Some joyful, some difficult, all of them waiting quietly, like another stretch of open highway just beyond the next bend. By the time the first light of morning reached the horizon, the snowstorm had become nothing more than a memory. The road ahead was dry again, stretching peacefully across open farmland. Another day was beginning, just as thousands had before it. As we continued west, I started noticing something about Uncle Bob. He never seemed interested in reaching the destination as quickly as possible. Instead, he enjoyed everything that happened along the way. He noticed old barns standing alone in distant fields. He pointed out abandoned sections of Route 66 whenever we passed nearby. Somehow, he remembered the names of tiny towns most people drove through without a second glance. To him, every mile belonged somewhere. Every bridge had a story. Every mountain carried a memory. Years later, I realized that experienced drivers don't simply memorize highways. They become part of them. Around midday, we stopped at another small diner. It wasn't marked on any travel guide. It didn't have a famous name, just a faded sign, a gravel parking lot, and the smell of fresh pie drifting through the open door. The waitress greeted Uncle Bob before he even reached the counter. She smiled the way people smile at someone they haven't seen in a long time. Not with excitement, but with genuine happiness. Watching them talk, I realized something. She wasn't asking about his truck. She wasn't asking about work. She was asking about his family, about his grandchildren, about the fishing trip he'd mentioned months earlier. It reminded me that truck drivers often have two homes, one where they sleep, and another scattered across thousands of miles of highway. A favorite diner in Nebraska, a fuel stop in Wyoming, a quiet rest area overlooking a river in Tennessee. Little places that become familiar simply because you've returned to them enough times. After breakfast, we walked slowly back toward the trucks. The parking lot was beginning to fill with travelers. Families loaded suitcases into station wagons. Construction crews climbed into pickup trucks. Another long-haul driver checked the tires on his trailer before pulling onto the interstate. Everyone was starting another ordinary day. Before climbing into his Freightliner, Uncle Bob walked once around the truck. Not because he had to, because that was his routine. He checked every tire with the toe of his boot. He looked beneath the trailer. He tugged lightly on an airline, ran his hand along one of the mud flaps. There was no checklist in his hand. After so many years, the checklist lived entirely in his memory. I began doing the same thing before every trip. At first, it felt unnecessary. Then it became habit. Eventually, it became something I couldn't imagine skipping. The best lessons on the road are rarely taught with words. They're learned by watching someone who has done the job well for decades. As the afternoon passed, Uncle Bob finally began talking about his old Freightliner. Not because I asked, because the truck itself seemed to invite the conversation. Its paint had faded under countless summers. Tiny stone chips covered the front bumper. The chrome mirrors carried small scratches collected over hundreds of thousands of miles. To anyone else, it looked old. To Uncle Bob, it looked experienced. He often said that every mark on a truck had earned its place. A scrape from backing into a warehouse in Oregon. A dent from flying gravel somewhere in Montana. A worn steering wheel polished smooth by 40 years of steady hands. None of those things bothered him. If anything, they made the truck feel more alive. He never chased shiny new paint or polished chrome. His Freightliner was clean, always clean, but it was never perfect. Perfection wasn't the goal. Reliability was. I once asked him if he had ever considered buying a brand new truck. He smiled quietly before answering. He said new trucks smell like fresh plastic, clean upholstery, and unopened boxes. Old trucks smell like coffee, rain, diesel fuel, leather gloves, and memories. I never forgot that. Even now, whenever I climb into an older truck, I understand exactly what he meant. Every cab slowly becomes a collection of small moments. A photograph clipped above the windshield. A lucky pocket knife tucked beside the seat. A travel mug that's been filled thousands of times. Maps folded and unfolded until the edges grow soft. None of those things make the truck drive better, but somehow, they make every mile feel more familiar. As evening approached, golden sunlight reflected across the long hood of Uncle Bob's Freightliner. The old truck looked almost timeless, like it belonged to every decade at once. We drove for another hour without speaking. There was no need. The rhythm of the highway carried every thought forward. The steady hum of two diesel engines blended with the whisper of tires rolling over smooth pavement. Watching that old Freightliner disappear and reappear beneath the evening light, I found myself hoping that one day, after enough miles, someone might remember me the way people remembered Uncle Bob. Not for how fast I drove, not for the truck I owned, but for the kind of person I chose to be along the way. That evening, as the sun slowly slipped below the horizon, Uncle Bob reached for the CB microphone for the first time in hours. His voice remained as calm as ever. There were only a few words, but somehow, they carried the weight of a lifetime spent on the road. Tomorrow, he said quietly, I'll tell you about the day I almost quit trucking. For a moment, I thought he was joking. I couldn't imagine Uncle Bob wanting to leave the highway behind. Yet the way he said it, with a soft smile and a long silence afterward, made me realize that even the strongest stories sometimes pass through difficult chapters. And somewhere beyond the darkening horizon, that chapter was waiting. The highway was quiet again by the time darkness settled over the plains. The last colors of sunset faded slowly behind us, leaving only the gentle glow of headlights and amber marker lights stretching across the interstate. For a long while, neither of us spoke. The road had its own rhythm now. The steady hum of the engines, the soft whisper of tires against the pavement, and the occasional flash of reflective signs were all the company we needed. I found myself thinking about what Uncle Bob had said before sunset. The day I almost quit trucking. The words didn't seem to fit the man I had come to admire. It was difficult to imagine someone like him ever wanting to leave the road behind. He seemed as permanent as the white lines painted on the highway. Several hours passed before his voice finally returned over the CB. calm, unhurried, exactly as always. It happened sometime in the spring of '84. There wasn't anything special about the load, just lumber headed for Colorado. The weather was good. The truck was running well. Everything was exactly the way you'd hope for. He paused for a moment. And sometimes, those are the days life surprises you. He explained that he had been driving almost non-stop for nearly 3 weeks. Not because anyone forced him to, because he was young enough to believe that working harder was always the answer. Back then he measured success by the number of miles he drove. The more miles, the better the month, the better the paycheck. He rarely stopped unless he absolutely had to. Coffee replaced proper meals. Sleep became something he promised himself he would catch up on later. Many young drivers make that mistake. Most eventually learn a better way. One afternoon, somewhere in western Kansas, he pulled into a quiet rest area. Nothing unusual, just a handful of picnic tables beneath a few large cottonwood trees. He shut off the engine, opened the driver's door, and for the first time in weeks, he simply sat there. No radio, no paperwork, no destination filling his thoughts, only silence. He looked across the empty fields. The wind moved gently through the tall grass. Somewhere nearby, meadowlarks sang without any concern for schedules or deadlines. It struck him that he couldn't remember the last sunrise he had actually stopped to watch, or the last sunset. He had driven through both, hundreds of them, yet he had barely noticed. That realization stayed with him, not because he had stopped loving trucking, but because he had started treating the road like a race. And the road was never meant to be won. He stayed at that rest area much longer than he had planned, nearly an hour, doing absolutely nothing. He watched clouds drift across the prairie. He listened to the wind. He finished a cup of coffee that had long since grown cold. When he finally started the truck again, something had changed. Not outside, inside. From that day forward, he made himself one promise. No matter how busy life became, he would always leave enough time to enjoy the places the job allowed him to see. If a scenic overlook appeared, he stopped once in a while. If an old diner looked inviting, he parked the truck. If the sunrise painted the mountains gold, he watched it. Those moments never delayed a delivery by very much, but they changed the way he remembered the journey. Listening to him, I realized something. Most people spend their lives waiting for vacations to slow down. Uncle Bob had learned how to find peace in an ordinary workday. That may have been his greatest talent. Not driving, not repairing engines, not crossing snowy mountain passes. Simply noticing the beauty hidden inside everyday miles. Around midnight, we crossed a long bridge over a wide river. The water reflected the moonlight like polished glass. Far below, a single fishing boat drifted quietly near the shoreline. Uncle Bob slowed ever so slightly, not because the bridge required it, because the view was worth another few seconds. I smiled. Even after hearing his story, he was still living exactly the way he described. The miles continued slipping gently beneath our wheels, one after another, without hurry, without effort. Eventually we stopped for the night at a small truck stop just inside Colorado. It wasn't crowded. Only a dozen trucks rested beneath the parking lot lights. I parked beside Uncle Bob's Freightliner. For a few moments, we both remained inside our cabs, neither of us climbing out immediately. Truck drivers understand that feeling. Sometimes, after a peaceful day on the road, you're in no rush to leave the driver's seat. The engine ticks quietly as it cools. The heater hums softly. The dashboard lights glow with familiar warmth. It feels less like sitting in a truck, and more like sitting in a small home that has traveled with you across the country. Before turning in for the night, I looked across at Uncle Bob's Freightliner. Its amber marker lights still glowed softly against the darkness. The old truck had probably seen more sunrises than I had birthdays. Yet tomorrow morning, it would wake before dawn, start with the same deep rumble, and head back onto the highway once again. Some people spend their whole lives searching for where they belong. Watching Uncle Bob that night, I realized he had found his place many years earlier. It wasn't a town. It wasn't a house. It wasn't even a particular highway. Home, for Uncle Bob, had always been wherever the road met the horizon. And somehow, I was beginning to understand exactly what he meant. The next morning arrived quietly. Long before the sun reached the horizon, the truck stop was already beginning to wake. One engine started in the distance, then another. Soon, the familiar chorus of diesel engines filled the cool morning air. I climbed out of the cab with a steaming cup of coffee in my hands. The sky above Colorado was still deep blue, with only a thin ribbon of orange beginning to appear in the east. Uncle Bob was already awake. That didn't surprise me. He had probably been awake for half an hour. He was walking slowly around his Freightliner, completing the same careful inspection I had watched him perform the day before. Not because anyone required it, because after 40 years, it had become part of who he was. He checked every tire, looked beneath the trailer, paused for a moment beside the fuel tank before climbing into the cab. Every movement was calm, unhurried, almost peaceful. Watching him, I realized something. There are people who work for a living, and there are people who quietly turn their work into a way of life. Uncle Bob belonged to the second group. As we pulled back onto the interstate, the first sunlight reached the tops of the distant hills. The road stretched westward beneath a sky that promised another clear day. The miles passed easily. Neither of us spoke very much. After spending 2 days together, words no longer felt necessary. Sometimes I would glance ahead and see the old Freightliner rolling steadily toward the horizon. Its faded paint glowed softly in the morning light. Its amber marker lights were still visible, even beneath the rising sun. It wasn't the newest truck. It wasn't the fastest. But somehow, it looked exactly the way a truck should. Around mid-morning, we crossed a long valley. Golden fields stretched in every direction. A freight train moved slowly along tracks several miles away. Windmills turned lazily in the distance. Everything seemed to move at its own gentle pace. Uncle Bob had once told me that the road teaches patience better than anything else. Back then, I thought he meant traffic, or weather, or long climbs through the mountains. Years later, I understood he meant something much deeper. Patience with other drivers. Patience with machines. Patience with yourself. The highway doesn't reward people who rush. It rewards people who keep moving, 1 mile at a time, one sunrise after another. Near lunchtime, we reached the junction where our routes separated. My load continued south, his continued west. We pulled into a wide rest area overlooking a broad valley. The mountains stood quietly in the distance, their peaks still holding patches of snow. Neither of us hurried to climb out. We simply stood beside the trucks, enjoying the cool breeze that drifted across the overlook. For several minutes, neither of us said a word. The silence felt comfortable, like two old friends who didn't need conversation to enjoy each other's company. I looked at Uncle Bob's Freightliner one last time. The old truck carried its years proudly. The paint had faded. The chrome had lost some of its shine. The bumper held tiny marks from countless highways. Yet somehow, it looked stronger because of them. Every scratch had a story. Every mile had left its mark, not as damage, but as proof of a life well lived. I thanked Uncle Bob for helping me through the storm. He smiled the same quiet smile I'd seen since the night we first met. He simply tipped the brim of his old cap, as though helping another driver had never been anything unusual. Maybe to him, it wasn't. We shook hands, a firm handshake, the kind shared between people who understand the road. Then he climbed back into the Freightliner. The old diesel came to life with its familiar deep rumble. For a few moments it idled quietly beneath the morning sun. He pulled onto the interstate without any drama. No long goodbye, no grand speech, just another truck beginning another day. I watched until the Freightliner became smaller and smaller. Its amber lights slowly disappeared into the shimmering afternoon air. Finally, it blended completely with the highway. That was the last time I ever drove beside Uncle Bob. Over the years, I asked about him whenever I stopped at truck stops where he used to visit. Sometimes someone had seen him a few months earlier. Sometimes they hadn't. Little by little, the stories became memories. One waitress told me he had finally retired. Another driver thought he had moved closer to his grandchildren. Someone else said the old Freightliner was parked in a barn somewhere, still polished every Sunday morning. I never learned which story was true. Maybe all of them were. Maybe none. But something curious happened after that. As the years passed, I found myself doing many of the things Uncle Bob had once done. I carried an extra flashlight, an extra pair of gloves, a spare thermos of coffee. If I saw a young driver looking uncertain during a snowstorm, I slowed down just enough for him to follow. If someone needed help changing an airline, I stopped. If a rookie sounded nervous on the CB, I answered, not because I had to, because someone had once done the same for me. Only much later did I realize what Uncle Bob had really left behind. It wasn't an old Freightliner. It wasn't the miles. It wasn't even the stories. It was kindness, passed quietly from one driver to another, across generations, across millions of miles. Sometimes I wonder how many truck drivers are carrying that same kindness today without even realizing where it began. Maybe one of them once followed an old Freightliner through a snowstorm. Maybe another shared a cup of coffee with a gray-bearded driver in a quiet diner. Maybe someone simply heard a calm voice on the CB during a difficult night. The road has a remarkable way of keeping good people alive. Not in photographs, not in monuments, but in small acts that continue long after they're gone. Even now, whenever I drive across Interstate 80 on a cold winter night, I sometimes catch myself looking a little farther down the highway, just in case, half expecting to see an old Freightliner, amber marker lights glowing softly beneath the stars, keeping a steady pace, never rushing, always moving forward. And every now and then, when the night is quiet enough, I can almost hear that calm voice again. Don't chase the storm, just drive your truck. After all these years, I still do. That's where my story ends tonight. If you'd like to hear more from the road, hit subscribe and rest easy, my friend.